Buenos días a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Leticia Merino y soy coordinadora de Sustentabilidad de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la UNAM. Es muy grato dar la bienvenida a todos a este último módulo de la serie de seminarios Tópicos de Frontera en Sustentabilidad 2021. A lo largo de este año hemos tenido 10 módulos donde se han abordado desde distintas perspectivas, desde las visiones de distintos participantes,
of different participants.
Los objetivos de desarrollo de la Agenda
The objectives
2030
of
de la
the
Universidad de
Agenda
Naciones,
2030
de la
of the
Organización,
United
de
Nations
Naciones
Organization.
Unidas. Como cierre de esta serie, vamos a
As a
referirnos
closing for this
al
series,
ODS 17, Alianzas para lograr estos objetivos, desde las
to
universidades,
approach these,
analizando
these
el papel de las
universities,
universidades
analyzing the role in the paper
para promover estos
in order to
objetivos
promote
dentro de sus
these
campus y desde las propias
and
universidades,
from the universities
hacia las sociedades donde se ubican y
to the universities where they're located.
Tenemos la suerte de contar con
We are
tres
very lucky to have
muy fuertes ponentes. La
three
doctora María
participants.
Ivanova, de la Universidad de Massachusetts, la doctora
Maria
Victoria
Ivanova
de la
from the University
Universidad
of
de
Massachusetts,
British
Boston,
Columbia, y María del Coro Arismendi, nuestra
and
querida
Maria del Coro.
doctora Arismendi, directora de la FE Iztacala,
She's the director of the
primera
FES Iztacala
coordinadora de sustentabilidad de la UNAM. Las
and
tres
first coordinator
tienen
of sustainability at UNAM.
desde sus espacios un compromiso de años con
They
temas
have
de sustentabilidad en sus
compromise from years
universidades y desde sus
in their
universidades.
universities and
La
institutions.
pregunta que les
The question
planteamos para
that we
orientar
are
participación
giving them
es
is
cómo pueden
to
las
how
instituciones de
the
educación superior
higher education institutions
crear alianzas, promover
create
alianzas para
alliances
impulsar la sustentabilidad en sus políticas institucionales y en los ámbitos en que se ubican. Quisiera también agradecer a Héctor Zavala de la UNAM Boston su apoyo en la realización de este último módulo. Antes de presentar y dar a nuestras ponentes, me gustaría recordarle a la audiencia que les invitamos a escribir sus preguntas en el chat de Zoom y de YouTube. Y quiero presentar también, antes de empezar, breves semblanzas de nuestras ponentes. La doctora María Ivanova es profesora asociada de Gobernanza Global y directora del Centro de Gobernanza y Sostenibilidad de la Universidad de Massachusetts en Boston. Es directora de los programas de doctorado y maestría en Gobernanza Global y Seguridad Humana. También es investigadora visitante en el Centro de Inteligencia Colectiva del MIT y fue nombrada por un periodo de 4 años asesora del Comité Científico Conjunto del Programa Mundial de Investigación sobre Clima en 2021. En 2021 se publicó también su libro The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP, a 50 for the MIT Press. La doctora Victoria Smith es directora de Compromiso Regional e Internacional con la Iniciativa de Sostenibilidad de la Universidad de British Columbia, donde trabaja con el personal, los estudiantes, la facultad y los socios externos para ayudar a promover el liderazgo de la Universidad de British Columbia en sostenibilidad. Victoria también es directora ejecutiva de la Red Internacional de Campus Sostenibles, una red global con más de 90 miembros en 30 países. La misión de la ISCN es promover un foro internacional para apoyar a las instituciones de educación superior en el intercambio de información, ideas y mejores prácticas para lograr operaciones sostenibles del campus e integrar la sostenibilidad en la investigación y la enseñanza. Además, la doctora Smith trabaja en nombre de la oficina del presidente de la UBC para administrar la coalición universitaria del Centro de Cambio Climático, una red de 23 universidades de investigación de América del Norte. Victoria tiene más de 25 años de experiencia en el sector público y privado en sostenibilidad y tiene una maestría en educación y comunicación ambiental. Y la doctora Coro Arismendi realizó su licenciatura en biología y estudios de posgrado en el Centro de Ecología de la UNAM Es actualmente profesora titular C de tiempo completo y pertenece al Sistema Nacional de Investigadores en el nivel 2. Su amplia y destacada trayectoria académica y científica han determinado que fuera nombrada para asumir la responsabilidad de coordinar las actividades académicas y científicas en diferentes puestos, entre los que están ser coordinadora del posgrado en Ciencias Biológicas de la UNAM, miembro del Consejo de Estudios de Posgrado de la UNAM, titular de la Coordinación Universitaria de Sustentabilidad de la UNAM, miembro del Seminario Universitario de Sociedad, Medio Ambiente e Instituciones, lo digo con mucho gusto y reconocimiento, y actualmente es directora de la Facultad de Estudios Superiores de la UNAM en Iztacala. Muchas gracias y sin más, los dejo con nuestras ponentes.
All right. Should I be speaking now? Unfortunately, I could not hear the translation. If you can give me a sign of whether I am the one to start speaking, I would appreciate it. Yes?
Sorry, Maria. We'll give you a sign.
You will, or this was the sign? I apologize. This is the first meeting I have been with interpretation.
Maria, I think you're up first and then I'm after you.
Yeah, so I can start? Okay, excellent. Well, let me begin. Welcome everybody to this space, and it's really a pleasure to share it with so many of you, and indeed be among you in Mexico, but virtually. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Maria Ivanova. As you heard, I do teach at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And today I would like to share with you some of the work that I have been doing at a fairly high abstraction level in terms of the role of individuals and institutions as leaders. Ultimately, what we are trying to do in sustainability is lead by example. And I'd like to share with you how institutions do that, how individuals do that in the broader space of environmental governance. I am a scholar of global environmental governance, and I study the United Nations as the institution that delivers a lot of the information about the environment and a lot of the policy guidance on the environment. I will start by talking about the United Nations because I will speak about multilateralism, the mechanisms, the institutions that bring countries together to imagine policies, to put them into action, to deliver on them. So the United Nations is the multilateral institutions that governments created after 1945, after the Second World War, to help bring them together in the same space, bring them together in the same intellectual and values space. How do we solve collective action problems? Indeed, when we talk about sustainability, a lot of our issues relate to collective action. The actions of some are critical to the results for all. Indeed, the actions of all are critical for results for everybody. Why am I speaking about this? What makes me qualified? I have studied the United Nations and its multilateral institutions as a student, as a scholar, in the archives that you see here on the left of the United Nations Environment Program, the archives of the UN more broadly. I have spoken to policymakers in policy assemblies like the UN Environment Assembly. And as you heard already, I had the honor to serve on the Scientific Advisory Board of the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. But let's take a step back and look at the multilateralism, the institution that the United Nations is. It started at the San Francisco Conference in 1945 with the charter that noted, the last lines here, we resolve to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims, the aims of the Charter of the United Nations, to combine our efforts. The United Nations is the platform for collective action, for multilateralism. But how do we deliver on that multilateralism? I just want to share with you the power of individuals in these multilateral institutions. We see the United Nations as being based in New York. We take it as a given. The United Nations is in New York City. But the very location of that premier, core, critical international institution was decided because of the leadership of an individual or several individuals. John D. Rockefeller III, who was the son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., actually delivered the $8.5 million check for the purchase of the 6-block space on the East River in Manhattan to build the United Nations headquarters. That happened in March of 1947. And today we take it as a given, but it was a competitive process. Countries competed to have the United Nations base their headquarters in those countries, even in those cities. And the leadership of individuals at the time saying, John D. Rockefeller's family saying, we would like to provide the conditions to host this multilateral institutions in New York City was absolutely critical. Since its creation, this multilateral institution, the United Nations, has won the Nobel Peace Prize, the highest honor in multilateralism, 12 times. 12 times. The UN High Commissioner on Refugees, that is UNHCR, won the Nobel Peace Prize twice, in 1954 and in 1981. Indeed, we have seen a debate about the usefulness of the United Nations. This is from 6 years ago in the Boston Globe, the newspaper, the public arena in the city that I currently live in, where scholars and policymakers were debating whether the United Nations was effective, whether it was fit for purpose. John Bolton, who was the US ambassador at the time, saying that the United Nations has become vast, sprawling, overwhelmed by unsustainable ambitions, inadequate capacities, and plain reality. And John Ruggie, now the late scholar at Harvard University, he says the UN is indispensable. It convenes disparate parties over difficult issues and holds important normative power. So this dichotomy of indispensability versus criticism for inadequacy has defined a lot about the United Nations and indeed our overall multilateral responses to issues of environment and sustainability. Perhaps we remember environmental multilateralism personified through the Paris Agreement signing ceremony in 2016. On Earth Day 2016, you see here the General Assembly with all member states actually celebrating the signing of this flagship agreement, the climate change agreement and the Paris Agreement, that we just witnessed the discussions in Scotland, in Glasgow, with the Conference of the Parties 26 or COP 26. But the issues that were discussed at the COP, the issues that we are seeing today, go back quite a long time. We see that the challenges that we have identified currently actually date back to the beginnings of the environmental system in 1972, when countries came to Stockholm for the first UN conference on the Stockholm environment. You see, this is how the conference newspaper portrayed the reality at the time. We are in one ship, in one earth, and yet all of the member states are pulling in different directions. Multilateralism today is very similar to the vision of the difficulties that were articulated in 1972. But today I'd like to share briefly the story of one institution, the UN Environment Program. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I recently published the book, the first academic book on the UN Environment Program. Surprisingly, there have been no academic books about this institution, even though the study of international organizations has covered many international organizations like the World Bank or the World Health Organization. So what I'd like to share with you is that UNEP is the anchor institution for the global environment. Why is this important when we talk about sustainability in higher academic institutions? Because this is the anchor where we as scholars, as students, as policy proponents can go to and engage in articulating collective action, in pushing for collective responses. And so the origin story of UNEP is the one as the world's ecological conscience. I also want to stress that the design was deliberate. The form, the function, and the financing of the organization were clearly articulated from the very beginning. And they were designed to create an organization that was fit for purpose. Is it fit for purpose today? We have to think about that. We have to research those issues. And this is where academic institutions are critical. We can also analyze to what extent does the institution meet its goals, goal attainment? To what extent does it resolve the problems that it has to resolve? And UNEP has resolved some of the key global problems, the depletion of the ozone layer, but it has also faced serious challenges like coordinating the environmental activities of the UN system. At its core, there are three characteristics that have determined success or challenges, and that is capacity, connectivity, and credibility. To what extent do you have the necessary financial, institutional, and personal means? That is capacity. How are you connected to your constituencies? The communication channels, the travel distances, and how credible are you? To what extent do you deliver results? And how do people perceive you being the authority in a particular field? And ultimately, what I would like to stress today is that leadership really matters. The leadership of individuals leads to a leadership of institutions. This is how I have engaged with the field, is by convening conversations with the individuals that imagined the institutions and that created the institutions. In 2009, I convened for the first and now only time the 5 UNEP executive directors. And this is the photo that you see on the right. These are the 5 men and 1 woman at the time who led the UN Environment Program from 1972 until 2009. That was 2009 that we brought them together. But we also, at that same meeting, we also brought together the people who imagined the system, Ambassador John MacDonald in the photo on the left, the people who were leading at the time, Ambassador Lumumba Diaping, who was the chair of the G77, and emerging leaders, the people you see around them. These were young people who applied to be part of this conversation so that they would be engaged in history making, so to speak. So I want to emphasize that the role of individuals is absolutely critical in every institution, whether we speak at the global level, at the local level, or at the campus level, which is very, very micro level indeed. And so these are the 5 executive directors who at the time, you see here the sealed the deal for Copenhagen, and that is the COP 15 in Copenhagen in 2019, and we are now at COP 26 in Glasgow. And maybe now we have achieved the goals that they set out. I will not talk about Unep's financing. I will just want to stress that the framework of capacity, connectivity, and credibility I use to analyze an institution, but it can be used to analyze any institution, whether it's international or whether it is a campus level institution. So the people, the resources, the infrastructure, representation, the authority, and the legitimacy are critical factors. And they can help us when we think through sustainability on campuses, on cities, and at the international level. And so I'm driven ultimately by the goal to engage with the United Nations and asking the questions, what is the role of academia? We do have an explicit role as a connector of ideas, connector of individuals, and connector of plans to make change. But the United Nations and the UN Environment Programme is also a space where influencers and other institutions should be coming together to collaborate, where we could inspire imagination and catalyze change. To this end, I began the Unep at 50 dialogue series to commemorate the 50th anniversary of this international institution. The first 2 dialogues were with Inger Andersen, the current executive director of Unep, and with Achim Steiner, who was a previous executive director and is currently the head of the UN Development Program. We have continued the conversations throughout, and the next dialogue will happen this Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time in Boston with John Scanlon, who was a high-level official at UNEP, but was also the Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the CITES Convention. I invite you all to join this dialogue and engage with us. And finally, I would like to share with you the news about a grant that we received recently from Carnegie Corporation of New York to reimagine environmental multilateralism while focusing on small states. We, at the Center for Governance and Sustainability, will be working to think through the multilateral institutions and say it is not sufficient to think about the large countries or the big powers like the United States, China, and India. We have to think about the smaller states, whether in Africa, in Latin America, or in Asia, and their leadership role in making multilateralism work. And with this, I thank you for your attention and look forward to engaging.
Well, thank you, Maria, for a great talk. I mean, this gives us a lot of insights and inspirations and some ideas or how we should proceed and how to move as academic institutions. So thank you very much. This has been very insightful. And now, I mean, it's the turn of my friend Victoria Smith, with whom we are working, it's to be said, and to invite the audience to a Congress of the ISCN that we'll have the pleasure to call in Mexico City. Thanks for being here, Victoria, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Leticia, for the very kind introduction. And thanks to UNAM for inviting me here today to be with you. This is just fantastic. And I'm pleased to be sharing this panel with my colleagues. Just let me get my screen here. Can you see that okay? Oh. Is that working? Can we have a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
Yes, Victoria, but it's not in slide mode.
Okay, there you go. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So again, just by way of introduction, Victoria Smith, I'm the Director of Regional and International Engagement with UBC Sustainability. And the other hat that I wear is as the Executive Director, as Leticia said, of the International Sustainable Campus Network, ISCN. But to help set the context for my talk, I wanted to share a little bit about where I live and where I'm joining you from. So I'm based in Vancouver, and I would like to start by acknowledging that I live on the ancestral, unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I don't think of Vancouver and the west coast of Canada as being on the front lines of climate change. Yet in the last 6 months, we've experienced 3 significant climate-related emergencies on top of already dealing with a pandemic. First, we had a heat dome this summer that killed off, our scientists have estimated, 1 billion marine animals on our coastline, which was devastating. We saw extreme drought conditions, which is very unusual for rainy West Coast Vancouver, and extensive wildfires. And in fact, one that wiped out, sadly, an entire community just north of Vancouver in one day. And this month, and in fact today, right outside my window, we are experiencing an unprecedented atmospheric river, rainfall, and flooding that will likely become Canada's most costly natural disaster in history. For about a week, our entire city and region was cut off. Every single highway out of the region and into the region was not passable. So here we are. Climate change is right here. It's right now. It is being felt in all regions of the world, and surprisingly that it is being felt as much as it is on the West Coast. Yet in spite of all of this, I still feel hopeful. I've spent my entire career in various roles, building partnerships, bringing people together around sustainability and climate. And I really do fundamentally believe we can collectively make change. The question I wrestle with on almost a daily basis is simply, will it be fast enough? So I'd like to address 2 key questions today in my talk. Number 1, what are the components needed to successfully implement sustainability in a complex system like a university? And what have we learned at UBC that we can meaningfully share with others? And number 2, how do we respond to the climate emergency as academic institutions? And what partnerships are needed? When we look at the framing for the UN SDG Goal 17 around partnerships, the framing language is one that requires inclusive partnerships at the global, regional, national, and local levels. And I would really like to reinforce that we can't do this alone. So at UBC, we have a long history of sustainability, although that's changed in meaning over the years. In our 100-year plus history at our campus, we've transformed quite dramatically, perhaps most dramatically from the middle picture, which is in the mid-70s. Our campus, almost 50% of the landmass of the campus was parking lots. To the shot on the right that you see, which is really our efforts over the last several decades to build out a model, sustainable, vibrant community. So just by numbers, we are a fairly large campus by Canadian standards, certainly not compared to our colleagues in UNAM and the size and scale of your student, staff, and faculty. But we do have almost 100,000 people who live, work, and study at UBC, and the size and scale of the physical infrastructure is significant as well. So in terms of sustainability efforts, we do have 3 decades plus of key milestones that we can be very proud of. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but just so you have record of this with my presentation. And perhaps most recently, we were very pleased in 2019 and 2020 to be ranked by the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which is a new ranking system looking at how universities are performing in the sustainable development goals. UBC was ranked #1 in climate in 2019 and 2020, so we're very proud of that accomplishment, but there is so much more to do. So what are the key success factors? In my opinion, having watched UBC evolve over the years in our efforts, Maria talked about the importance of leadership. I can't emphasize enough. Having an executive champion or champions is, I think, one of the most vital components of successfully embedding sustainability in academic institutions. It's important to have an aspirational vision. Students need to be front and center as part of the university's work. And we need an ambitious and pragmatic plan. So we need a plan that can actually show us how we're going to implement that aspirational vision. And then, of course, we need to be networked with our peers and partners. We cannot continue to think about doing this on our own. So the first example I'll share, and what I'd like to do is over the next few slides, share with you examples of where I think UBC is leading on those key success factors. And the first example I'll share is in 2014, our executive leadership asked us to think about what does next generation sustainability look like for UBC. We had a very engaged president at the time, and a few years prior, in 2009, had developed an academic sustainability strategy, which was unique because it moved us beyond the typical campus operational focus of our efforts. But they wanted us to think even bigger. So that challenge culminated in the development of a very aspirational vision out to 2035, which was our 20-year sustainability strategy. And it was an incredible process to engage our community in that endeavor. And the plan is around 3 key pillars of teaching, learning, research, operations and infrastructure, and the UBC community. The current narrative at the time that was dominating sustainability thinking and planning was really about a damage limitation model. That is, we need to do less harm. And we wondered if we could go beyond that kind of thinking, if we could move to a model of regenerative sustainability. So to do more good, to go to net positive, not just net zero. So that's the framing for the plan. So the vision really is about how can UBC contribute to improvements in human and environmental well-being, not just damage limitation and reduction. We feel that this notion of regenerative sustainability, which is the underpinning of the vision, the core belief of our team was that we need to inspire people to want to act. We need a hopeful vision that they can think about their own well-being and how they can contribute to the well-being of their environment. Not a sort of doom and gloom message of we really need to stop doing so much harm. We know that doesn't motivate people to act. If anything, it can send people back into just feeling overwhelmed with the magnitude of the situation. Because of our size and scale of the campus, we really are effectively, in our terms in British Columbia, we are basically a medium-sized city, yet we are the owner, the operator, and the end user of our buildings, our utilities, our residences, so we can experiment with new technologies and innovation through our campus as a living lab model. Now, this is a model that we thought about 10 years ago. Most university campuses are now doing some form of campus as a living lab, but we continue to believe that this is really a test bed of innovation, new technology, new process, and we have risk tolerance that we can try things that other, a city can't necessarily do. We are also committed to working at multiple scales. The building scale, so the building on the left-hand side is the Center for Interactive Research on Sustainability at UBC. That's where my office is. We are working at the campus scale, which is maybe more similar to a neighborhood level undertaking in a local government, and then at the citywide scale with our partners. So this really does make our work of interest to cities around the world. And of course, the city of Vancouver, our neighbor, is one of the global thought leaders in local government sustainability and urban sustainability. So there's just a really nice synergy between UBC and the city of Vancouver. So the challenge for us now, though, is how do we communicate the breadth and depth of the work that we're doing to really make it approachable and people can see themselves in the work, whether it's students, staff, or faculty. So this graphic we developed a few years ago was really an attempt to depict the wide range of activities, but try and focus on the unique aspects of what UBC is doing in sustainability. And of course, a key element of our success is connecting to peer institutions through networks like ISCN. We are a network close to 90 members in over 30 countries, which really truly allows us to have global connections in this work and learn from other thought leaders in the space. We've actually implemented many ideas that have come from other campuses. And one example more recently being a new climate labeling process for our food service outlets. So students, staff, and faculty can now see as they're ordering food, the climate impact of those choices. And I had actually been on an exchange with a colleague of mine to the Frey University campus in Berlin, and we saw a very fantastic food labeling process of not only the nutritional ingredients, but the climate calculation impacts of the food. And so we said, we really have to bring that back to UBC. So we're constantly reaching out and trying to learn from others and share. So I spoke earlier about the climate emergency, and UBC in 2019 really renewed its commitment to climate leadership by declaring a climate emergency. The statement was championed by our president and unanimously endorsed by our board of governors. And we also made a commitment to, and we're in the process of fully divesting from fossil fuels, which is not a small undertaking. The declaration was really driven by student leadership. An open letter was signed by thousands of student, staff, and faculty calling on UBC to declare an emergency. And we had over 5,000 student, staff, faculty participate in the September 27th, 2019 global climate strike. The declaration really does attempt to recognize the severity, complexity, and disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis, and it embeds climate justice throughout. So the first step, just by way of process, of course, when you're undertaking a plan like this, engagement is just the most important thing to start with. So the first step for us was to convene a climate emergency task force. It was co-chaired by a senior faculty member and a student, and extensive community consultation was done. We started just before the pandemic hit BC, COVID-19 in March 2020. So a lot of the planned in-person events had to go to online, but we still heard from over 4,000 students, staff, and faculty, alumni, and community members across both of our campuses. So the community input was gathered. We convened working groups of experts, community experts, and climate task force members. And importantly, we also convened an Indigenous Community Advisory Committee to ensure that Indigenous people's perspectives shaped the development and implementation of the climate emergency response. So at the end of the process, we developed a report. It's very extensive, but it really focuses in on 9 key strategic priority areas. And it really reinforces UBC's role, multiple roles really, as a leader, an enabler, and a partner in addressing the climate crisis. It's really focused on driving impact, not just on our campus, but impact in our local, regional, and international engagement efforts. And it also recognizes that UBC needs to embody and embed climate justice and support communities and engage with partners in the same vein. And lastly, we have to think about our climate emergency response in alignment with building back from the recovery efforts from the COVID-19 pandemic. I've heard so many people in the last 20 months say, I want to get back to normal. And I've said, we don't actually want to go back to normal. We need to build a future that is different than how we've been acting and living. So not to go into great detail, I just want to give you, again, the sort of breadth and depth of the extensive range of actions in the climate emergency. There's 28 actions altogether that cut across teaching, learning, research, advocacy, and working with marginalized communities and external partners. So again, just so that you have this for anyone who is interested in looking into more detail about the climate emergency. But of course, one of the key priorities is our climate action planning for our campus. And just to give you a quick overview on that work, UBC's first climate action plan was launched in 2010. And it set out a target to move to net zero emissions by 2050. In 2020, we did an update to that plan, and it was really in 2016, and it was really focused on driving new technologies to achieve significant short-term reductions. And we're now just finished developing CAP 2030. And this moves up some of our targets for more aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the more near term. And it was just presented to our Board of Governors last week. What's different about CAP 2030 is there's also now an emphasis on scope 3 emissions or indirect emissions. So emissions coming from food systems, commuting, business air travel. So that is now embedded into our CAP 2030 process. We are lucky in our jurisdiction that we have both federal and provincial policy supports. We've got carbon pricing in place. So this really helps the business case of investments in renewable energies and clean technology. Not all jurisdictions have that, but we are in a unique position from that perspective. So the climate emergency really does map to so many other things we're doing on campus. It connects to so many different strategic plans. We've got our UBC strategic plan. We have an Indigenous strategic plan, which I think is the first in North America that I'm aware of. We have a global engagement strategy, a well-being framework, our 20-year sustainability strategy, and inclusion action plan. So we're really, the work ahead now is for the administration to really understand all the different respective leads that need to be working on the climate emergency task force recommendations and where there's synergies for work already underway. So one of the, this call to action has been very mobilizing for just so many parts of our campus, and reflecting on what's come out of it beyond the recommendations. I think there's many co-benefits that have emerged that we didn't necessarily think about going in. And probably one of the most important is empowering students as change agents. The climate crisis, we know, is a top issue for our UBC students. Many of those students report experiencing profound anxiety about their future. And by giving students a real seat at the table to help shape the decisions around climate action that we're doing on campus, we're actually tackling two different crises, the climate crisis and student mental health. Research shows us that action and agency are vital antidotes to anxiety. So this has, again, been a co-benefit we just didn't really anticipate going in. The other thing it's allowed us to do is accelerate existing priorities that were already started. So, obviously the operational emissions plan, CAP 2030, was accelerated in part because of the climate emergency task force process. We've been able to leverage opportunities for climate-based teaching, learning, and research activities. And then it's really accelerated our thinking around institutional and community learning about the impacts of climate on systematically marginalized groups. And then moving beyond campus sustainability, I've just shared with you the breadth and depth of all the things we've been doing for decades now, but there's been a call for us to go beyond our campus borders and really asking the university to take bolder action. So this climate emergency also represents a shift toward working to significantly transform the economic, social, and political systems that are needed to support this work. And of course, it continues to encourage us to think about external partnerships, climate justice partnerships, equitable development, and resilient communities. So the unit that I work in will now take on a responsibility for convening and coordinating implementation. So there's so many different folks that will be involved in this work. It's across whole institution priority, and we will start tracking that now. So just to close, I'd like to finish by sharing a short video that was developed for a virtual COP26 event that we just hosted on the role of universities in the net zero transition. ISCN co-hosted that event, and Dr. William Lee from UNAM was on our president's moderated roundtable, so the role that universities can play in net zero. So this is UBC President Santa Ono. He was a moderator for the session, and I think we all did short pre-recorded videos as an input to the session. And I think his overview captures many of the elements I've mentioned during this talk. So strong executive leadership, an aspirational vision of what's possible, and responding to the climate emergency. So we're super excited to continue learning and growing and connecting with others who are on this journey with us. And I thank you very much. Look forward to our conversation, and I hope you enjoy this video.
As the first university in Canada to develop a sustainable development policy, the University of British Columbia has incorporated climate action into every aspect of its operations, from our infrastructure and services to our research, education, and innovation programs. UBC has pioneered the implementation of climate action plans and the use of its campuses as living laboratories to develop the next generation of climate solutions. Under these initiatives, UBC's main campus in Vancouver has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by more than 38% below 2007 levels, while at the same time growing in student population and new construction. New technologies can be converted into city-scale solutions that use the campus as a living laboratory, for example, building a biomass energy plant. The following video, produced by my colleague, Dr. Walter Merida, shows how the UBC Vancouver campus acts as a test bed for innovative, sustainable, system-wide solutions. Dr. Merida and his colleagues envision the campus as a city-scale laboratory where new solutions can be tested in a risk-tolerant environment and scaled up to communities, cities, and regions. They are focusing on fuel cells, electrolyzers, and hydrogen generation technologies because they can link renewable resources to scalable services. What if we could create a platform for land-controlled drones using a 5G network? We are using our campus as a living laboratory to fly drones beyond visual line of sight using a 5G network. Partnerships with governments and other stakeholders are crucial if we are to achieve a net zero transition. For instance, bringing rapid transit to UBC will mean thousands of students, faculty, staff, and visitors will be commuting via clean technology on their daily commute instead of GHG emitting buses and cars. We're happy to share our experiences with other universities interested in learning more about how a university campus can be a living laboratory. In 2019, UBC issued a climate emergency declaration. It committed UBC to develop a collective response that embeds climate justice throughout its activities and priorities. The declaration gives impetus for UBC to update plans to address the climate crisis with the urgency it requires. The Climate Emergency Declaration and Climate Emergency Community Engagement Process reaffirms UBC's commitment to accelerate emissions reductions in alignment with the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. UBC Vancouver's Climate Action Plan 2030 sets a bold vision, an accelerated pathway for a broader scope of emissions reductions. The plan will position UBC as a model of how universities can mobilize to address the climate emergency and Paris targets through bold, impactful actions to accelerate and deepen GHG reductions across operations and expanded action to reduce extended emissions. It's clear that universities can and must play a role in transitioning to a state of net zero greenhouse gas emission. Working with other partners in higher education, business, government, and NGOs, we can and we will create a better future.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you a lot, Victoria, for a very inspiring and important presentation for us. I mean, a part of the experience of British Columbia, of UBC, being a very inspiring example of how to move universities to sustainability and the role they can play. I mean, I really like your statement about the need to move from to deliver more positive messages to our constituencies, to students, to the faculty, to community, and how action and agency can enable us to confront anxiety, to reduce anxiety. I think this is very important and very important guidance, and I hope to continue working with you. So thank you very, very much. And now, y ahora es un gusto presentar a Coro Arismendi, que conocemos bien los que estamos en la UNAM, y quiero decir que la Facultad de Estudios de Iztacala, en el contexto mexicano, ha sido un caso muy, muy valioso, muy importante, un ejemplo a seguir sobre cómo construir sustentabilidad. Digamos, aquí hay un plan de 8 años que Coro está retomando y empujando y desarrollando, de cómo construir sustentabilidad en las condiciones de México y en uno de los sectores, una de las regiones más empobrecidas, más marginales del Valle de México, dentro del área de influencia de nuestra enorme universidad. Muchas gracias, Coro, estamos contigo.
Gracias. Voy a compartirles mi pantalla. Aquí está. ¿Sí? ¿Se ve bien? Gracias. Bueno, yo les voy a platicar un poco de un caso, digamos como que un estudio de caso. Mis dos antecesoras hicieron como una muy bonita introducción a todo lo que se debe de hacer en sustentabilidad, y es algo que en la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Iztacala se ha retomado durante los últimos años, haciendo pues como un caso, un estudio de caso específico de un campus en donde se pueden implementar acciones de sustentabilidad que pueden llegar a contagiar, como decía Leti, a una comunidad bastante pobre en los alrededores. Esto es el campus de la FES Iztacala. Está situado en el norte de la Ciudad de México, en el municipio de Tlalnepantla. Si ustedes ven en la diapositiva de la derecha, la línea roja es el municipio de Tlalnepantla y el cuadro amarillo es la FES Iztacala. El municipio de Tlalnepantla se caracteriza por ser un municipio altamente industrial. Como ustedes pueden ver, todo alrededor de Iztacala, todo esto que se ve como blanco, como grandes planchas blancas, son industrias que producen diferentes insumos para el país, ¿no? Es una zona que está muy al norte de la ciudad. Como pueden ustedes ver, aquí hay unos remanentes de bosque al norte de la ciudad, pero todo lo que rodea, digamos, cercano a la FES Iztacala es básicamente cemento. Aquí en la diapositiva de la izquierda tenemos un acercamiento a lo que es la FES Iztacala, y como ustedes pueden ver, pues es un lugar que tiene espacios verdes, y esa es siempre ha sido la teoría en la FES Iztacala. Tratemos de hacer un espacio mejor para que los estudiantes puedan aprender mejor en un entorno amable, más amable probablemente que el que ellos tienen en sus casas. La FES Iztacala, ya no sé qué hice, aquí está. La FES Iztacala es un área verde, es un refugio de fauna y flora en una zona muy industrial. Así se ve cualquier rincón de la FES Iztacala. Tenemos 46 años de que se construyó esta escuela, y ya tenemos aquí árboles grandes, maduros, que forman un pequeño bosque dentro de la escuela. ¿Qué es lo que hemos hecho en esta facultad? Aquí. Bueno, ¿qué se ha hecho en esta facultad? ¿Qué se ha hecho por transformar la Facultad de Estudios Superiores en una entidad sustentable? Bueno, tiene que ver básicamente con el terreno, con la escuela como tal, y con la comunidad que habitamos en la FES, y con los estudiantes y los profesores que estamos aquí. Quiero decirles que la FES Iztacala es un campus que tiene un poquito más de 17,000 estudiantes que están repartidos en 7 carreras, 6 presenciales y una a distancia. Es decir, es una comunidad grande que necesita atención, y es una comunidad que está, como dijo Leti, en una zona bastante marginada de esta ciudad. Entonces, lo primero que se empezó a hacer desde hace tiempo, desde la administración pasada, es hacer una campaña de reforestación y de mantenimiento, y tener este mantenimiento en las áreas verdes de manera continua. Entonces, bueno, esto se ha logrado. Si ustedes ven, esto se tomó en 2015 y si ustedes ven la FESI el día de hoy, se ve más o menos igual. Es decir, es un área verde que tiene espacio para que los estudiantes puedan respirar. Se han hecho campañas junto con estas campañas de reforestación, de control de muérdago, porque las plagas, en efecto, han llegado a tirar árboles, se vuelven muy pesados. Entonces se controlan todas estas plagas y se trata de dar este mantenimiento preventivo. Ahora, tenemos 3 áreas como ejemplos de áreas verdes que se usan para docencia e investigación. Una es un jardín botánico en donde tenemos plantas básicamente de zonas áridas que han sido cultivadas, rescatadas de otros sitios que han sido construidos y en donde se hace docencia e investigación. Tenemos un mariposario en donde se han hecho labores de cultivo de las larvas, como se ve en la parte izquierda inferior, en donde se tiene un proyecto de investigación grande de cultivo de estas mariposas y donde se ha fomentado tener plantas para que estas mariposas puedan sobrevivir y puedan estar en estos sitios. Aquí también se hace muchísima investigación y mucha docencia y es una zona que visita la gente de los alrededores para estar un rato en la naturaleza y poder disfrutar de estos animales. Después hicimos un gran jardín un pequeño jardín de colibríes, pero que tiene una gran variedad de plantas sembradas allí. Y también tenemos muchos colibríes y otros animales que invitan los colibríes a su jardín, como las mariposas, los abejorros, las avispas, las abejas. Y mucha gente lo viene a ver y mucha gente se sienta a pasar un rato ahí. Bueno, para tener todas estas áreas verdes se requiere mucha agua y el agua es un recurso limitado en esta zona de la ciudad por varias razones. Una, porque no hay mucha y otra, porque es un recurso caro que a la FES Iztacala le consumía una parte importante de su presupuesto. Entonces, en 2015 se construyó una cisterna muy grande en donde el municipio nos trae agua tratada y esa agua tratada la utilizamos para regar estos jardines y mantenerlos en buen estado. Una vez que tuvimos esta gran cisterna, nos dedicamos a hacer todos los ductos para poder regar con esta área potable, agua tratada, porque la FES Iztacala tiene algo así como 23 hectáreas, entonces no es trivial poner el agua tratada, nada más poner la cisterna y después cómo la distribuimos. Entonces hemos hecho todas estas obras de construcción de ductos para poder regar las diferentes áreas de la FES. En esta pandemia que nos ha modificado mucho la vida, hemos logrado, porque la escuela estuvo vacía, avanzar hasta la etapa 7 de la construcción de estos ductos y ya tenemos cubierto con agua tratada como el 85% de la FES. Ha sido más fácil en estos momentos porque la escuela está vacía, pero ha sido difícil porque no tenemos a todos los trabajadores para poder hacer estas obras. Entonces, de todas maneras, se avanzó bastante despacio, pero bueno, 85% es casi tenemos todas las 23 hectáreas con posibilidades de tener riego por agua tratada. El agua tratada también la hemos estado llevando a otras construcciones, como son los sanitarios, para poder utilizarla y consumir menos agua potable en ellos. Hicimos estos sanitarios que utilizan agua potable, sobre todo en la planta baja. Hicimos también una instalación para que el agua que sale de los lavabos del segundo y el tercer piso pueda ser utilizada en los excusados de los pisos siguientes y así utilizar menos agua en el consumo diario. 17,000 alumnos consumiendo agua nos consumen un montón de recursos que no estamos en posibilidades ni económicas ni ecológicas de hacer. Hicimos también toda una obra para cambiar todos los mijitorios, por ejemplo, para hacerlos secos y para utilizar todas las aguas de los lavabos en los demás sanitarios. Tenemos muchísimos sanitarios y un uso muy, muy constante de estas facilidades. Después hicimos estas sí la hicimos durante la pandemia, unas grandes artesas en donde poner el pasto que vamos cortando y todos los residuos orgánicos para hacer composta. Esto nos va a ayudar a mantener el campus sin tener que, por un lado, pagar que se lleven los residuos verdes y por otro, generar esta composta que nos va a ayudar a mantener en buenas condiciones el campus. Después es un campus grande que se usa de las 7 de la mañana a las 10 de la noche todos los días, de manera que también el consumo de electricidad es grandísimo. Desde el 2015, 2014 se empezaron a cambiar todas las luminarias que se tenían tradicionales por luminarias de luz LED. Es un proceso lento que lo hemos venido haciendo, pero que es muy importante, por un lado para mantener la seguridad de los estudiantes y por otro para bajar el consumo eléctrico en la FES. Tenemos en 2021, ahorita vamos a poner en estas vacaciones de invierno, vamos a cambiar un número importante de luminarias para tener una mejor iluminación y una iluminación más sustentable. También hemos comenzado a tener luz solar, paneles fotovoltaicos, y hemos conseguido pues unos pocos, pero tenemos un plan hecho con el doctor Adrián Fernández y con la Iniciativa Climática Sustentable para tratar de poner la FES Iztacala en un consumo de electricidad solar. Necesitamos dos cosas para poder lograr esto, son 40 edificios, de manera que techos tenemos, lugar donde poner los paneles tenemos, pero necesitamos pues un poco de financiamiento, que se está haciendo un plan maestro para lograrlo, y voluntad política para poder tener la FES Iztacala sustentable en cuanto a luz solar, que sería un gran ahorro para esta escuela. Después empezamos como con la comunidad, que hemos hecho para tratar de que los estudiantes y los profesores comiencen a pensar más sustentablemente. Y entonces pusimos bebederos en todas las clínicas, porque además de la FES Iztacala, el campus que les mostré, son 23 hectáreas, pero además tenemos 7 clínicas periféricas en zonas más marginadas de la ciudad, en donde se hacen básicamente labores de odontología, de medicina y de optometría gratis para la población que allí vive. Entonces, aprovechando todo este influjo de gente que entra y sale en las instalaciones, pusimos bebederos en todas las clínicas, algunos que son más agraciados porque tienen esa manguerita de arriba y se pueden usar para rellenar botellas. Otros al principio nada más se ponían con la parte de abajo para beber agua. Y les digo que esto es un poco lamentable, porque estos que nada más tienen la parte de abajo, pues los tenemos completamente cerrados, porque con el virus es muy complicado y puede haber contagios entre los estudiantes. Entonces, por ahora nada más estamos habilitando las mangueritas para llenar el agua. Son bebederos de agua potable que medimos la calidad del agua cada 4 meses. Vemos que mantenemos que esté en buen estado, y cada 4 meses global, y cada semana los estudiantes están haciendo prácticas para medir la calidad del agua y asegurarnos que esté en buenas condiciones para los estudiantes y para las personas que nos visitan, que son muchos. También tenemos un programa de manejo integral de residuos en la FES, residuos sólidos, basura. Hemos hecho campañas muy grandes de separación de materiales para tener papel, cartón, PET y materiales orgánicos. Desgraciadamente, ustedes ven la gráfica de arriba, teníamos una curva ascendente de recuperación de residuos reciclables, que en 2020 se fue a cero, y se fue a prácticamente cero porque la escuela ha estado cerrada desde marzo del 2020 hasta prácticamente hace unos meses que empezamos a venir de manera presencial otra vez. Entonces sí hay un retroceso, pero esperamos que pronto ese ese año se borre y podamos seguir con nuestras campañas de reciclaje. Tenemos, ustedes pueden ver aquí, tenemos una cantidad muy importante de residuos que se separan y que después se venden, que se utilizan para la composta. Se hace composta de humus, de lombriz, y con esto también sacamos una buena cantidad de recursos para nuestros jardines. Tenemos otras campañas como la de Huella Verde para tratar de educar a esta población a que cuiden los entornos, a que no utilicen unicel cuando comen. Muchos de estos estudiantes comen en la escuela, entonces hay una campaña de cero unicel para sacar el unicel de los puestos en donde se vende la comida y hacerles incentivos. Por ejemplo, si ellos traen su plato o su recipiente donde poner la comida, les sale más barata. Y esto es bueno para los estudiantes por un lado y para la gente que está aquí en los puestos porque no generan tal cantidad de basuras. Tenemos una campaña importante de reducción de PET que se ha extendido a las comunidades circunvecinas que luego entran a la FES a tirar sus botellas de PET, estas se reciclan. Y tenemos también una campaña importante de pilas usadas que trasladamos para hacer reciclamiento correcto en las unidades que se tienen en la Ciudad de México. Tenemos también una campaña permanente de reciclaje de medicinas que llevamos a los lugares especializados, en donde algunas se utilizan y otras se reutilizan en la elaboración de nuevas. Hemos hecho mucho material audiovisual y muchos videos para que la gente, para tratar de incidir en la educación ambiental, no nada más de nuestros estudiantes, sino también de sus familiares y de la gente que está a los alrededores. Y tenemos muchos retos para el 2022. Queremos volver a iniciar con todos estos programas, hacer que los estudiantes sean voluntarios, que los prestadores de servicio social nos ayuden, que nos ayuden en la difusión de la importancia de la sustentabilidad, no nada más dentro de la FES, que ya es un campus bastante sustentable, sino fuera, para que todos empecemos a aprender esta idea de la sustentabilidad. Todas las ideas de sustentabilidad, hasta donde yo las he visto, se quedan mucho en los planes, digamos que en documentos. Y las personas, la persona que vive allí, que vive en condiciones, además, no de riqueza, sino al contrario, como de pobreza, tiene que saber qué puede hacer y por qué le es útil hacer esto. ¿Por qué ahorramos con quitar, dejar de usar la luz, el agua potable para regar? ¿Por qué ahorramos con usar el agua tratada en los sanitarios? ¿Por qué ahorramos con la luz solar? Todo esto son campañas que necesitamos difundir, que necesitamos que la gente escuche. En la FES Iztacala trabajamos de manera conjunta la Secretaría de Desarrollo Institucional y la Secretaría Administrativa para lograr que la FES Iztacala sea un espacio sustentable. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Coro, por esta presentación, y yo creo que Iztacala es un ejemplo a seguir para el conjunto de la universidad en muchos sentidos. Hay muchos aprendizajes, y el reto ahora es replicarlo esto en la escala a otras entidades y en la escala de nuestra universidad, y bueno, ojalá que tengamos, yo sé que vamos a tener una interacción muy cercana de colaboración y de aprendizaje con ustedes. Y pues gracias por tu tiempo. Yo sé que estás súper agobiada.
Gracias por invitarme, siempre estaré.
No, Coro, o sea, un gustazo, o sea, tú eres de casa. Pasamos ahora a la sección de preguntas. Tenemos algún tiempo y yo quisiera preguntar a la doctora María Ivanova, I mean, if you could, no sé si hablo en inglés, bueno, voy a tratar de hablar en inglés. If you could develop a little bit more, on how universities, particularly universities from developing countries, can meaningfully relate with Unep and with the UN system, particularly around the accomplishment and the monitoring of the ODS and the Agenda 2030. And tengo una serie de preguntas para Victoria. Aquí hay algunas preguntas sobre presupuesto, si el presupuesto es importante, si juega, pues, qué tema juegan o han jugado los problemas de presupuesto, la disposición de presupuesto, la búsqueda de presupuesto en el desarrollo de la experiencia de sustentabilidad en la Universidad de Columbia Británica. Y otra importante, nos dicen que cuáles han sido los mayores retos que el programa de sustentabilidad de UBC ha enfrentado durante la pandemia de COVID. Y cuáles han sido sus principales estrategias para involucrar a la comunidad en el proyecto de COVID. Y yo preguntaría a Coro, ¿qué reflexiones tendría para replicar la experiencia de Iztacala más allá de las fronteras de Iztacala? Muchas gracias. Y damos este espacio para esta primera ronda de preguntas.
If I may just say thank you, but when you were asking the questions for Maria Ivanova, and then the interpretation switched into Spanish. So I did not, the only question I did not hear was the question for me. I heard for the others. You're muted.
I'm sorry. How universities, and particularly universities...
Hold on. Mute. Okay, I had the original audio muted so that I could hear to the translation. Can you...
So should I speak in English or Spanish?
If you can ask to me in English, since everybody
that's fine.
Heard and understood.
That's fine. I mean, let's try for a third time. I mean, how universities, and particularly developing countries universities, can meaningfully engage with UNDP and UN on the assessment and promotion of the 2030 agenda in particular?
That is a great question, and it's indeed an area that I am working on currently. Indeed, Victoria, with Melissa Brown-Goodall, who is now at the University of Pennsylvania working on sustainability, and we have been discussing these issues. We're writing now a chapter on this, because we see universities as the knowledge sector. And unfortunately, the knowledge sector is not very active in the multilateral sector. Why is that? This has been a preoccupation of mine. Every time I speak at the United Nations, I urge the United Nations to engage universities better, more systematically, and to take the ideas that are generated at universities, take them to scale. What Victoria was presented, what is being done around the world, whether it's in Mexico indeed or in British Columbia, can be taken up. We can learn from each other. Unfortunately, the United Nations does not have the appropriate mechanisms. It simply does not. And whether we create a special system, like a major group, we do have stakeholders group, which is academia and higher institutions, but they only work on education. So we do not have a group of academics that systematically work on environment, on governance, on sustainability collectively. Yes, there are various organizations that usually convene the Ivy League institutions or research institutions of a certain size or a certain stature. And even the one, Victoria, that you're leading, it's exclusive. It does, how does an academic institution become a part of it? And I speak from the point of, from where I'm sitting. I am sitting in Boston's only public research university. There are 52 colleges and universities in the greater Boston area, which is the largest concentration in the world. Out of those, only one is a public research university, and that is the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I'm happy to say that UNAM has an office at UMass Boston, and I am meeting your faculty, your law faculty, who are coming this Thursday. So I will be meeting them in person. And this was the reason why UNAM selected to be at UMass Boston, because we're the only public one. So I say, let's work together and let's figure out how we bring these ideas in a more systematic way. But currently there is no such way, Leticia. It just doesn't exist.
I know. Thank you very much for your answer. And as you said, let's work together. I mean, this is very promising. And then I have, well, then the questions for Victoria.
Great, thank you, and very thoughtful questions as well in the chat. So I'm happy to continue to respond to those as they come up and provide whatever resources I can. So I think I'll tackle the financial one first, if I understood the question. I don't think the question was around divestment. I think it was more around how are we funding all of our activities, if I understood the nuance of the question. Again, I think we're in a unique position for a couple of different reasons in British Columbia and in Canada. And I'll start with the provincial context. So our provincial government, well over a decade ago now, in around 2008, started working on becoming the first provincial government within our country to mandate carbon neutrality. So it was a policy, because we're public sector, our hospitals are public sector, our schools, our colleges and universities are public sector. And so it was very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction objectives that the provincial government set out in 2010, that all public institutions needed to be carbon neutral. And they could become carbon neutral by investing in their own facilities, or whatever they couldn't decrease, you had to purchase offsets. So the very first thing that created for us was almost $100 million liability out over 25 years. So that drives the business case. So now all of a sudden, some of these newer technologies that are coming online, biomass, other forms of renewable, all of a sudden become more feasible. So that was sort of the first piece. And I would say in the first 10 or so years, UBC spent almost $100 million. Now that sounds like an extraordinary amount of money, but when you look at the liability that would be accumulated over time just from the carbon neutrality offset commitments, we could make the business case. And those were huge expenditures, but they were a biomass demonstration facility. We converted our entire campus from steam to hot water. We could include more renewable sources in that. So that was the first piece. Then the second piece is, of course, we have a carbon tax, and we have now a federal carbon tax. So all of that to say, you know, I guess I'd almost put the question back is, what role can universities and academics and students play in getting these policies adopted so that then you're given the right mechanisms to get things done? So that's sort of the roundabout way of saying, if the mechanism is not in place, what levers need to be drawn on to have that? Because there's no question, when we go to our board and say, you know, we have tens of millions of dollars of liability, they're more open to spending money on our renewable energy systems. That's the first question. The second question, I think, was around the climate emergency work and the pandemic and how that affected our efforts. You know, the first thing I would say is, like many institutions, we are large, complex, and slow moving by nature. So when you're trying to harmonize the urgency around truly having declared an emergency, I mean, we are this today, as I said, people are sandbagging to stop flooding from our rivers, like as we speak today. So we know how people respond in a real emergency. All hands on deck, you drop whatever you're doing for the day and you go help sandbag. So trying to move that kind of urgency into a large, complex system like a university is challenging at best. And it creates a natural tension. I think students were pushing hard, and administration is trying to keep up while also creating proper process in place and due diligence on reviewing, expenditures on projects and things like that. The pandemic affected us in a couple of interesting ways. Of course, the consultation for the plan itself, everything pivoted online as all of our colleagues around the world grappled with in those first few months of March, April, and May. But then I think we started to see the benefits of reduced commuting and all of these other things that we could start to calculate into how we are responding to the climate emergency. So I think we're at a pivotal point now of what we've learned. We can teach online, we can do meetings online, and in fact, it's more effective, I think, to create either a fully in-person event or a fully online event. When you do hybrid, you're creating almost two different events, and it's harder to engage folks. So my personal experience is I've been able to have a much higher level of engagement with all of my colleagues, be it at the UBC campus or in Europe and in South America and Asia, because most of us are all online now. So I'm curious to see what of these interventions will actually last, because they are demonstrating benefit in responding to the climate emergency. So we're right in that process right now. We're slowly going back to campus. But the work is getting done, and I'm tremendously proud of the teams that are doing it.
Coro.
Creo que yo, ¿verdad? Bueno, la pregunta era ¿cómo lo replicamos a otras escuelas? Creo que la FES Iztacala pues tiene ventajas y desventajas, ¿no? Una ventaja es que es un campus enorme pero cerrado, o sea, es enorme pero está delimitado por algo, ¿no? Hay una barda que delimita las 23 hectáreas, los 40 edificios, y cada clínica, tenemos 7 clínicas, pero cada clínica también es un campus cerrado en condiciones, si quieres, pues adversas o como las quieras, pero que están cerrados. Entonces se puede trabajar mucho con la sustentabilidad de ese pedazo de tierra, digamos, ¿no? Eso creo que es una gran ventaja en comparación con C1, por ejemplo, con el campus central, en donde como es abierto, es mucho más complicado, y además es abierto y es compartido, ¿no? Como decía por ahí un amigo mío, aquí por lo menos hay un señor feudal, ¿no? O sea, hay un señor que se encarga de todo, y ese pues puede repartir, ¿no? Eso es más fácil políticamente que tener CU, que tienes muchas facultades con muchos directores y muchas complicaciones. Entonces creo que esa es una cosa, pero la otra cosa que es importante es empezar por la educación. Hay que tratar de incidir en la gente, en las personas que vienen aquí, porque si no podemos tener todo maravilloso, que si la gente que viene aquí quiere seguir tomando agua en botellas de plástico, lo va a seguir haciendo. Si quiere seguir comiendo en unicel, lo va a seguir haciendo. Hay que encontrar alicientes para que puedan hacerlo y puedan hacerlo mejor. Y yo creo que eso sí se puede hacer en campus como CEU, y se puede comenzar a decir estas cosas, ¿no? También se puede comenzar, aunque las instalaciones son más viejas, ¿no? Yo les decía, la FES Iztacala tiene 46 años, CEU hay facultades que tienen 80 o que tienen más años que esto, y entonces las instalaciones cuando más viejas, más difíciles de arreglar, hacerlas sustentables, ¿no? Evidentemente, si aquí nos hemos tenido que tener mucho ingenio para hacer muchas de las obras sustentables, en CEU habría que tener el triple. Y bueno, la otra es, pues sí, el presupuesto, ¿no? En esta pandemia nosotros como universidad hemos sufrido de tener bajos presupuestos y de tener esos presupuestos que destinarlos a fuerza a la salud. Es decir, compramos muchísimos cubrebocas, compramos muchísimo gel, compramos muchísimas cosas, y no nada más para los estudiantes en general, sino para médicos, enfermeras que estaban en primera línea atendiendo el COVID, porque tenemos pasantes, tenemos internos que estuvieron en primera línea atendiendo el COVID. Entonces gastamos muchísimo en esos estudiantes que teníamos que atender sí o sí, porque no tenían equipo de protección para estar en un hospital atendiendo COVID, y lo estaban atendiendo. Entonces su destino pues era muy incierto. Entonces tuvimos que gastar gran parte de todos los presupuestos de la UNAM en atender estas necesidades, y ahora tenemos que irnos normalizando poco a poco para poder comenzar a hacer las otras cosas que también son importantes. Gracias.
Sí, por aquí hay también un par de preguntas para ti y para Victoria, que es cómo promover la participación de los estudiantes, how to create community engagement in these projects, students and community in general.
Yeah, so I'd almost...
and wait a little bit. And for Maria Ivanova, what do you think is the main factor that must be addressed in order to incorporate sustainability into an educational system? May it be treated directly by educational institutes or governments should help?
I think I missed the first part of that question, but I think it was how to promote student engagement.
How to promote community engagement, community including students.
Community including the students. So I would say that in fact, our focus in the last year or so has been less on promoting student engagement and more trying to be receptive to students asking us to do things differently. So that's almost the first, it's like it's hit a tipping point. I think the work of Greta and the school strikes all over, that the consciousness raising around this issue has just reached a tipping point where we're not working as much anymore to try and engage students. We're trying to help give them conduits for influencing the development of the climate emergency plan, or take place on or take part in actual actions that we're doing on campus. So I think our student population is incredibly engaged. And I saw one of the questions in the chat was around, did we think that by teaching a certain way in perhaps Canada or British Columbia, that influences how students think? In fact, when we talk to our student recruitment teams, they do surveys of incoming students. Why did you choose UBC? And in fact, sustainability and climate action is continuing to rise to the top of reasons why students, if they have the choice of 2 or 3 schools to go to, they are specifically choosing UBC. So I think we're getting a coalition of the willing and interested selecting to come to campus because of the work we're doing. So that's very, very helpful. In terms of our community engagement efforts, there's been a tremendous focus on engaging broadly in everything we do, whether it's the development of the climate emergency, our 20-year sustainability strategy. Most of my work is actually off campus, so working with regional partners. We do a lot of work with the City of Vancouver, our transit authority, health authorities, the utilities, because we know that this system is interconnected. And even though we are out on a peninsula at UBC, we are deeply embedded in the regional ecosystem that is sustainability and climate action. So I think that we just have a long history of that work. So those partnerships are there. We do less around public outreach, I would say, off campus. We don't really have necessarily a mandate or the resources to do a lot of public engagement, but we are trying to think through ways of doing that through our partners at the city. So that's, I would address it that way. But I'm very open to learning from others, because I think there is a need and there's a role for universities to play as anchor institutions in their jurisdictions. So I'd be very keen to hear from others on how they're tackling it.
Sí, yo creo que, pues estoy de acuerdo, hay que comenzar con hacer difusión de lo que se está haciendo, de lo que se necesita hacer y de por qué es bueno, porque de veras, por lo menos en México, la gente todavía no tiene una idea muy clara de por qué es importante no utilizar unicel, que por qué es importante no utilizar botellas de PET, sino traer tu botella. O sea, realmente sí hay que hacer mucha conciencia. Yo creo que en este país, a nivel de la comunidad y de las comunidades, lo que hay que trabajar muchísimo es educación. Y luego sí tener los modelos tecnológicos con los cuales desarrollar las ideas, ¿no? Y si no son tan tecnológicos, pues tener ingenio, ¿no? Nosotros en la FES luego no tenemos cómo hacerlo muy tecnológico porque es muy caro y no tenemos forma de pagarlo, pero entonces nos ingeniamos ahí soluciones bastante buenas que sirven años y años y años y que son mucho más baratas. Yo creo que si tienes el apoyo de la gente, de la comunidad, pues las cosas te salen, ¿no? Aquí los receptáculos de PET se llenan así terriblemente y la gente viene de fuera, viene de las calles y tú los ves que traen su bolsita de PET para depositarlo en nuestros depósitos. Y es muy bueno. También hemos trabajado mucho con los trabajadores, ¿no? Porque tienen que tener algún incentivo, si no como que les da flojera, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, el papel y el cartón que luego venden, lo venden ellos y ellos obtienen, pues no es una ganancia muy considerable, pero es un aliciente porque ellos pueden obtener 10 pesos, 15 pesos, 20 pesos y eso es algo que les va a ayudar a ellos en su economía. Entonces dejamos que ellos lo vendan en lugar de quererlo vender institucionalmente para tenerlos contentos y que se paren, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, hay que ir buscando así soluciones como creativas para problemas gigantes que no podemos resolver de otra forma en una universidad así, en un campus como este.
Muchas gracias. Perdón, muchas gracias, Coro. Y estaba la pregunta para María sobre cuál sería el papel del gobierno como catalizador de la sustentabilidad en la universidad y cuál sería la perspectiva del gobierno universitario en la institucionalización de la sustentabilidad universitaria. O sea, ¿cuál es el rol de los distintos actores, gobierno universitario, en la promoción de la sustentabilidad en las universidades? Can I translate?
Was that for me? I have to say the translation, it works fine, and then from time to time it just switches, and it's not there. But I see that there was a question for me in the chat. I'm happy to relate to that, and then the one below is in Spanish.
In the chat it's fine.
So that's, but I actually wanted also to react to what the conversation that we're having as a community today, and it is about both leadership at all levels, and it's leadership from the top, from the university, from the leadership of the university, whether it's a president or a chancellor, and like Victoria was noting and sharing the video with us about the president, and they set a vision, and it's at the same time it's that leadership from below, the demand, and this is where Maria del Coro was saying we are serving the community, we want to respond to the demand, and that's what is critical about sustainability, both at the university level and at society level. We need the demand, the leadership from the people, whether they're students, whether they're communities, and we need a vision, an aspirational vision indeed, from the leadership. This is why we vote and why we change governments, is because when they don't deliver what we want, we need new leaders. And indeed, it's a fantastic idea to have this survey of why are you choosing us, and sustainability appearing again and again as an important issue. I think we should adopt it in all universities. This is something that I will be taking away and talking to my university about it. But to me, the discussion today focused on exactly this, the spectrum of leadership. And that's why I started with from the individuals to the institutions. And yet the institutions are led by individuals. But what do they respond to? They respond to that pressure from the students, from the communities. And I just want to tell you, if I may, here a little story, because I have worked on sustainability quite a lot. I didn't speak about it today in my presentation, but in my previous academic position, when I was a faculty member at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, also a public institution, we redesigned and repurposed and restarted the university to focus on sustainability. There was a program or an institution that was rating various universities on their sustainability performance. And they wrote that William and Mary is performing at a grade of D-. right? From A to F, it's like one of the lowest grades. And then the students came to me and to other faculty, and we worked together and figured out what was it that was wrong. What we discovered is that the leadership of the university was not driven by the calculus of what will pay off. If we invest today, it will have a payoff. But what it was driven by much more was the values. How will we be perceived? How are the students reacting? Why are they choosing us? Indeed, that kind of bottom up. And when our students really decided to do something about sustainability, the leadership responded. But not only did they create the pressure, what we worked with the students to do is they decided to tax themselves. The student body created a series of referenda and polled their colleagues, will you accept a sustainability fee? And 82% of the students said yes. And the Student Senate passed a sustainability fee on themselves of $15 a semester, $30 a year, which generated $220,000 a year from the students. So that's every 5 years, you get over $1 million from your own student body who says, we want to be leaders in sustainability. But we did not stop there with the students. Then students and faculty worked together to say, and here's how this fund should be governed, how it should be spent. It should go to support research, to support student projects, to support campus projects. So it's that extra step of not only generating funding and saying, okay, you can use this, but also thinking about the governance, the utilization of it. And so this to me is an example of bottom-up leadership, but also the response from the leadership of the university. I would like to see more leaders of the universities incite students to do this kind of work, but I think that is happening by looking to each other for models. And so thank you for organizing this conversation today, because it's really important when we see who is doing what in this space and how we can learn from each other.
Muchas gracias, Maria. Thank you very much. Well, I don't see any more questions. I don't know if I am, perdón, no veo, se me olvida el idioma, no veo más preguntas. No sé si hay más preguntas. Si no, quisiera agradecer de todo corazón nuevamente a la oficina de la UNAM Boston por su apoyo en la organización de este evento, relacionarlos con la doctora María Ivanova por su apoyo en la traducción simultánea. Agradecer mucho a Coro estar presente con todo su trabajo y trayectoria, y no la vamos a dejar. Hay mucho que hacer y que aprender de Iztacala. Y muchísimas gracias a Victoria Smith por toda su experiencia y todas sus enseñanzas. Buenas tardes a todos, que tengan una muy buena tarde y pues a trabajar en nuestras universidades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
Gracias.
Bye.
Hasta luego.
Bye.
Goodbye.